since you brought up the Iran deal, or if to the extent it's even a deal, right now it's a memorandum of understanding, which is a very odd way of striking a ceasefire or moving towards a ceasefire. We should talk about that. So, I mean, what's your initial reaction, given that we know very little about the contents of the deal and are getting different narratives about its contents from the Iranian and U.S. sides?
I think the only significance is that Trump is admitting that he lost his regime change war. This is him putting that in writing, essentially, because the war was launched in late February with Trump claiming that when we're done here, to the people of Iran, you will take over. And so he was calling for regime change, and that failed. And when the kinetic part of the war failed, he then tried this oil blockade to prevent Iran from exporting any oil. And I think he was trying to wait out to see if Iran's economy would collapse under the combination of his blockade, the damage from his bombing, and of course his crippling sanctions. And that didn't work. And Iran's leverage over the Strait of Hormuz proved to be just too strong, along with its striking of U.S. military assets in the region and the threat it posed to Trump's Gulf allies, because he basically put them on the front lines of his regime change war alongside Israel. So he failed. And this memorandum of understanding essentially restores the status quo from before he started bombing. So essentially, he's admitting defeat of the regime change war. But is he opening a new chapter in U.S.-Iran relations? Is he going to lift these crippling sanctions that are designed to destabilize Iran? No. And I think that's pretty clear even from listening to J.D. Vance today, who is like inside the cabinet, inside the Trump's circle, is widely considered to be the most anti-interventionist. But the way he's talking, the policy has not changed. That while Iran has been willing to accept limits on its nuclear program for a long time, while Iran's been willing to accept limits on its nuclear program, the U.S. won't accept Iran's resistance to Israeli dominance. And because Iran refuses to capitulate on that front, Iran will continue to be targeted for regime change. And so I just don't think that aspect is changing. So it's a pause to Trump's regime change campaign, and it's an admission of defeat, but it's not peace.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the Korean War armistice, which was, 53, 54, which didn't end the war. The war still, there has been no peace, no actual cessation of hostilities between the South and the North. Actually, Trump attempted to end that, and that was sabotaged as well by the same elements that will seek to sabotage the Iran war, an actual ceasefire with Iran, and an actual durable peace with Iran. Many of the same elements, at least, and they were less powerful than the Israel lobby and the Zionist movement is. So we're sort of in a frozen conflict, and it's very obvious who opposes this deal in the West, and particularly in the United States. Sorry. The same elements that brought Trump into this war. The same elements that sat Trump down in the Situation Room and told him how this war was going to begin and lied to him, this doddering, kind of bought-off figure, on how the war would be won instantly in a kind of Venezuela-style triumph through decapitation strikes, which within 2 to 4 days would end the so-called regime and bring about mass opposition and the Iranian public rising up along with possibly the Kurdish proxies in order to basically dissolve the Islamic Republic of Iran. That was Benjamin Netanyahu and his proxies. Benjamin Netanyahu came here in DC in February and told Trump how it was going to be. Trump went along with it. No one within his cabinet or among his military intelligence principals actually stood up to him, other than, I think, General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who was leaking his opposition to the press and knew that they would blow through interceptor stocks, THAADs. They'd have to reposition THAADs from South Korea, which South Korea got at great cost to its relations with China, which costed economically. THAADs and Patriot batteries, PAC-3s would have to go over from Ukraine to defend Israel. And it was all I said it at the beginning, it was a Zionist war and it was going to fail. Everything that took place could have easily been predicted. And so this sort of consolidates the failure of Operation Epstein Fury. And now it's very clear, once again, who was responsible for this war. When you see Mark Levin fulminating, when you see Mark Thiessen fulminating, when you see Mark Dubowitz fulminating, these marks, what, I don't know, what Snoop Dogg might call mark ass busters, are all out there actually trying to make marks of the American public, but we're not marks anymore, or VIX. Everyone can see that this was a failed and very economically destructive Zionist war, and there should be recriminations and repercussions and retribution against these characters. That's what we would like to see. Unfortunately, I don't think Trump is going to be able to do that. You know, if I were Trump and I were in the war room right now, and I don't even know if he has a real actual war room, the way that, you know, that's based around his own thinking. I would be using every element in the media to humiliate these characters, denounce them, and I would even be launching investigations into FDD, Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, which was the main Israeli think tank planted in Washington, which devised this entire war from start to finish, starting with the decapitation strikes and moving into the so-called naval siege. They even, through Jared Kushner, had one of their staff members, Nick, what's his name? I'll think of it in a second. Nick Stewart, placed on the negotiation team to oversee the naval siege, which was just was deepening this neo-Suez crisis. So, you know, you really want to punish these elements if you're Trump, but I think these elements will eventually, along with figures in the Senate like Roger Wicker, chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who had been pushing for a renewed like Epstein Fury 2.0 as late as June 9th, the Wall Street Journal's editorial board, even elements in Fox News, obviously Mark Levin, they're going to come for Trump along with the Democrats and call him, the Democrats will be calling him Taco. You know, Trump always chickens out, trying to paint him as weak for making this deal. And I don't think Trump will be strong enough to stand up against that or to do anything about the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which is ongoing and has been used as a lever to sabotage this deal.
Well, I just wonder if we'll even get to a point where there'll be anything for neocons to push back on, because Trump says that this is a nuclear deal, but really it's the same thing if you listen to J.D. Vance today. So he made what I think is a contradictory statement, talking about the conditions under which the U.S. would lift sanctions on Iran, which for Iran is the biggest issue. For the U.S., the biggest issue is supposedly Iran's nuclear program. But we know Iran's already accepted constraints on that repeatedly under the JCPOA, in the talks that were brokered by Oman before the war, in the proposal since. So that part can be addressed. The issue for Iran is, will the U.S. lift its crippling sanctions that are designed to prevent Iran from having a functioning economy? And if you listen to J.D. Vance today, he's already offered contradictory conditions on in terms of what Iran would have to do. So first, $1 billion. What's not mentioned in these discussions is that's $24 billion in Iranian money. It's not as if Iran's being given anything by the U.S. It's Iran's own stolen money that the U.S. has held for decades. But note there, the crucial thing he said there is the main condition, the condition for sanctions relief from the U.S. is Iran constraining its nuclear weapons program. But Iran did that already under the JCPOA. But Trump broke that. But why did Trump break that? Because he wanted regime change. And he wanted regime change because Iran resists U.S.-Israeli hegemony. And so he's been demanding Iran's surrender on that front as well, that Iran stop supporting groups that resist U.S.-Israeli hegemony, namely Hezbollah. And Iran hasn't budged on that. And here's J.D. Vance, after just saying to CBS News that the only condition for sanctions relief is Iran's nuclear program. He then adds a second condition, not just about the nuclear program. So if that's the case, then forget it. There's not going to be a deal. So all this is, And this is what I think. This is what ultimately will blow up the peace talks. Trump will insist on this, that Iran cut ties to Hezbollah. Iran won't, and so everyone will just walk away. So what we'll have is a status quo ante. Hooray for Trump! The Strait of Hormuz has been reopened. Maybe in the process there'll be some limited sanctions relief on like the export of some Iranian products. Maybe a token amount of unstolen assets. But in terms of an actual deal, if this is the condition, as Vance just put it, and it's not just about nuclear, but it's also about Iran supporting its allies who resist U.S.-Israeli hegemony, then there's no peace deal.
Yeah, and that was, I mean, this is in the tradition of Steve Witkoff, the envoy, constantly shifting the goalposts. He would go to Iran, they'd have, or go to Oman, they'd have good talks, and then he would go back to Washington and say something entirely different.
Yeah.
For example, about Iran's alliances or ballistic missiles. And, he would say, and I remember Steve Witkoff said early on in the war, they're closing the Gulf of Hormuz. They can't do that. He didn't even know what the Strait of Hormuz was. There's a lack of understanding of the Iranian perspective and just the basic facts about the technical side of Iran's nuclear program or about the region. And J.D. Vance is supposed to be the restrainer here, who is in favor of the deal, and he can't seem to articulate any clear conditions. Everything's based on benchmarks. Reminds me of the Oslo Accords, where nothing was set in stone. There were no borders. Everything is contingent on further talks. Then you have the fact that insurance companies aren't going to back shipping for the next 6 to 12 months unless there is stability, which means this deal has to be enforced by the U.S. in Lebanon and elsewhere in order to open up the Strait of Hormuz and provide long-term stability. The U.S. is making everything contingent on Iran. It's actually contingent on the U.S. and U.S. leadership. And the U.S. has obviously been completely compromised by its relationship with Israel. So there's another reason to believe this won't actually open up the strait or provide economic relief. But obviously Trump is in panic mode. He's becoming a panicking because the midterms are coming up. The bottom has dropped out of his base. Young men are turning on Trump in record numbers. There's a new New York Times poll showing he's lost 10% of young white male voters in the last month or so. The numbers are horrible on this war. So he has good reason to want a deal, but he's not going to be able, I don't think he's going to be able to enforce it. And there will be I think we're looking at a frozen conflict. At the same time, those who got Trump into this war, as I said, they're not happy about what's going on. Mark Dubowitz, if you're suffering economically in any way, costs too much to fill up your tank and you drive for a living, you drive Uber, you deliver food, whatever, or, you have a long commute. If you're a farmer and fertilizer costs are through the roof and you're at risk of losing your farm, any working class American should thank Mark Dubowitz.
And going back to Wickoff for a second, just before I forget, he really illustrates how completely captive this administration is to the establishment war lobby, where initially he was talking about accepting the enrichment levels of the JCPOA, which were like 3.67%. He accepted that publicly. And then all it took was like a one-day freak out from the Israel lobby and other neocons, and he backtracked immediately and was now then claiming zero enrichment. So that's how easily this administration caves to the slightest pressure from the war lobby. And there's no indication that despite all the marks having their freakouts, that much has changed.
Yeah, I was watching him on Mario Nafal and he kept interrupting. He was like all geeked out. It was wild to watch Dubowitz in the sort of like Hitler in his bunker. He really sees this as an apocalyptic moment. But really what it just means is what it is for the Israel First lobby is a setback, a major setback. And there's going to be a recalibration of the U.S.-Israel relationship. There will have to be because of this, because of the deep unpopularity of themselves and of Israel in the United States. They're going to have to bury it behind opaque cooperation initiatives, which we'll talk about later. But I do not see this deal holding. Now, at the same time, I don't see in the near term a major conflict restarting, but who's to say?